I want you to picture a city that is just completely falling apart. We're talking a full-blown siege.
Right.
The enemy's right outside the gates. They've cut off all the food, all the supplies, the highways.
Forget about it.
They're totally empty. You step foot on them, you're dead. Inside the walls, the economy's gone. People are starving. And to top it all off, a plague breaks out. It is like the definition of a nightmare.
It's what military historians would call extremis.
Yeah.
Total societal breakdown. Everything that can go wrong has.
Right. So imagine walking up to someone in that city, someone who is clearly suffering, maybe they've even got the plague, and you ask them, hey, how are you doing? And instead of telling you about the hunger or the fear or the fever, they look you right in the eye and say, I am not sick.
It sounds delusional, or at the very least, extreme denial, like they've just snapped under the pressure.
That is exactly what I thought. It sounds like you're just gaslighting yourself. But the source we're looking at today argues that this isn't madness. It's actually a really profound psychological shift. We are doing a deep dive into a sermon from way back in 1886 by Charles Spurgeon. It's called Healing and Pardon.
And he's focusing on this one really paradoxical line from the book of Isaiah. The inhabitant shall not say, I am sick. The people that dwell therein shall be forgiven their iniquity.
And to really get why this matters and why it isn't just nonsense, we have to get the context Spurgeon is using. He sets the scene in Jerusalem during the Assyrian invasion.
And this wasn't just a bad week. The Assyrians were the terrifying superpower of their day. They had laid waste to the whole countryside. Spurgeon calls it a dark background, which is absolutely necessary to see the brightness of the text he's looking at.
So our mission for this deep dive is to figure out how Spurgeon connects those two things. How do you possibly get from my city is on fire and my body is failing to I am not sick? He seems to be arguing that if you deal with the internal problem, the guilt, you fundamentally change the experience of the external problem, of suffering.
It's a fascinating take on the mind-body connection. And this is long before modern psychology really dug into it. Spurgeon is suggesting that the state of your conscience dictates your reality even more than your physical symptoms do.
Okay, so let's start with the first big idea he brings up. He calls it present forgiveness. And he really, really hammers on that word, present. Why is that distinction so important for him?
Well, think about how forgiveness is often treated, right?
Yeah.
In religion or even just, secular ethics. It's often this future thing. An insurance policy. I hope I'm good with the universe when I die, or, eventually it'll all balance out. Spurgeon says that is totally useless for the person in the middle of a siege. If you're starving and sick, a future hope isn't enough to change how you feel now. He argues for a conscious, enjoyable pardon in the present tense.
He uses some pretty intense imagery to contrast this with just like regular happiness. He compares worldly fun, the distractions we all use to numb ourselves to a flash in the pan.
Or the crackling of thorns under a pot, which is such a great image. It's bright, it's loud, it's hot for a second, and then it's just ash. It doesn't last. Spurgeon's point is that without this deep, present sense of relief from guilt, you can't actually be joyful. You can be distracted, sure, you can be amused, but you can't have joy.
The phrase that really jumped out at me was wormwood. He says guilt turns an ocean of pleasure into wormwood. I actually had looked that up. It's that super bitter herb they use in absinthe, right?
Exactly. The metaphor is that guilt is a flavor contaminant. You could be the richest person on earth, sitting at a feast wearing the best clothes.
Yeah.
But if you have this gnawing sense of condemnation, this anxiety about your past, everything tastes like wormwood. The external stuff just doesn't matter because the internal experience is bitter.
That makes so much sense. It's like when you're really stressed about work or a fight you had, you can't even enjoy your favorite meal. It just tastes like nothing.
It turns to ash in your mouth. And the inverse is true. Spurgeon calls forgiveness the fountain of love. He brings up that biblical story of the woman who washes Jesus' feet with her tears.
Right.
The logic there is often misunderstood. She didn't wash his feet to get forgiveness. She did because she had been forgiven.
Oh, it's a reaction, not a transaction.
Yes, exactly. Spurgeon says a life without that sense of pardon is limp. It's weak. If you are constantly looking over your shoulder, afraid of judgment or death, you can't really live. You're kind of paralyzed. So before he even gets to the I am not sick part, he has to establish that the I am forgiven part is the engine for all human vitality.
Okay, so step one is realizing the internal baggage is heavier than the external siege. But this brings us to the part of the text that I really found the hardest to get my head around. The verse says, the inhabitant shall not say, I am sick.
Is a bold claim.
It's huge.
Yeah.
And Spurgeon has to deal with the awkward reality that well, people get sick.
Yeah.
You know, believers get sick, good people get cancer. Is he promising some kind of like faith healing? If I get forgiven, does my flu just go away? Because that sounds like a late night infomercial.
He navigates this really, really carefully. He admits that in the ancient context of Israel, there was often a direct link. You sin, you get a plague. You repent, the plague stops. It was a more transactional theology back then.
And he even points out that today there's often a real biological link, right?
Precisely. Like the example of the drunkard he uses. If someone is sick and poor because they're an alcoholic, and they find forgiveness and stop drinking, their health naturally improves. That's just cause and effect.
Okay, that's just logic. But what about the innocent person? The person in the city who didn't start the war, or someone today with a genetic condition? Spurgeon seems to be making a much deeper point than just stop sinning and you'll feel better.
He is. And this is the real pivot point of the whole thing. This is the most important part for us to understand. Spurgeon argues that for the inhabitant of this spiritual reality, the nature of the suffering changes, even if the suffering itself is still there.
How does the nature of it change? Pain is pain, isn't it? A broken leg hurts whether you're a good person or a bad person.
Not according to Spurgeon. He uses this legal analogy that I think makes it perfectly clear. He compares a magistrate to a father.
Okay, walk us through that.
All right, so imagine a boy is locked in a room. To an observer, it just looks like a boy in a room. But the context is everything. If a judge locked him in there, it's a prison sentence. It's a penal infliction. It's punishment for a crime. And the boy sits there thinking, I'm in here because I'm bad, and the authority is against me.
Right, that's just despair.
But if his father locked him in there, it's tender parental discipline. Maybe it's to teach him a lesson, or, and this fits the siege metaphor, maybe it's to keep him safe from something dangerous outside.
But the physical reality is identical. He's still locked in the room.
Identical. But the meaning is the complete opposite. One is retributive, the other is restorative. Spurgeon's whole theology here is that if you are forgiven, the judge aspect of God is gone. He says God cannot punish the same sin twice. Once in the substitute, Jesus, and then again in the believer.
So if I'm sick and I believe I'm forgiven, I can't see that sickness as karma, as the universe getting back at me.
Exactly. The sting of punishment is removed. It might become discipline or refinement or just life, but it's not a penalty. Spurgeon says this takes the gall out of the suffering. You aren't sitting there thinking, I deserve this because I'm bad. You're thinking, this is really hard, but I'm loved. And that is a massive psychological shift.
It kind of reminds me of the difference between pain in the gym and pain from an injury. If I'm lifting weights, the burn is good pain because I know it's building me up. If I trip and break my ankle, it's bad pain because it's just damage.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Forgiveness turns the suffering into gym pain. It reframes it as purposeful, or at least safe, rather than destructive. And he takes us all the way to the ultimate extreme.
To death.
To death. He says the bitterness of death is past. He calls it merely a gate of endless joy for the forgiven. If death is the ultimate penalty for sin, and the sin is gone, then death can't be a penalty anymore. It's just a transition.
Which brings us to the third part of this deep dive. And honestly, this is where I think it gets really practical. We've talked about the theology, but now Spurgeon talks about a change in language. The inhabitant literally stops saying the words, I am sick.
Yeah, it's about identity and focus. He gives 3 specific reasons why this happens, why a sick person would stop saying they're sick. And none of them are about being delusional.
The first one is basically just about volume control.
Chuckles.
Yeah.
In a way, yeah, he calls it overwhelming joy. The idea is that the internal celebration of being pardoned is so loud that you literally can't hear the complaints of your body. It's a signal-to-noise ratio thing.
He tells this story that I just loved about a man who'd been excommunicated from his church.
Right. This man had been put out of his fellowship, which in that community was basically social death. He was totally isolated. Eventually, he's reconciled and brought back in. And the pastor asks him, how are you? Now, you got to remember, this man was physically dying. He was in extreme pain. But he says, I am quite well now that you restore me to your scheme.
That is just wild. I am well while he's dying just because that relationship was fixed.
It proves we are fundamentally relational beings. The pain of being an outcast, of rejection, it is often sharper than physical pain. When that social and spiritual connection got restored, it just overrode the physical signals. He was well because he belonged again.
It really highlights how much of our wellness is actually about our community and our sense of acceptance. Okay, so then there's the second reason he gives. He talks about a wall of fire.
This goes back to the siege. In a siege, you're terrified of the plague spreading. Spurgeon makes a parallel. He talks about the moral pestilence of the world, corruption, bitterness, vice. And he argues that forgiveness puts a protective sanitary cordon around your soul.
So it's like, I might have the flu, but at least I don't have the plague of bitterness.
Exactly. He calls it being morally sane. If your character is intact, if you aren't infected by the rot of the world around you, then you are, in the most important sense, healthy. It's about prioritizing your spiritual health over your biological health.
It's like saying, my car has a flat tire, but the engine is running perfectly, so yeah, the car is fine.
It's a bit like that. The core machinery is intact. And if the soul is the engine and the body is just the tires, then yeah, the machine is fine.
But my absolute favorite reason, and this is where the sermon gets really cinematic, is the third one, the spoil of victory.
Oh, the lame taking the prey.
Yes. This image is incredible.
It's from Isaiah 33. The Assyrian army, they flee in the night. They leave everything behind, gold, silver, armor, food, everything. And the text says the inhabitants of Jerusalem just rush out to collect it all.
But not just the healthy ones. Spurgeon makes a point of highlighting that the crippled and the decrepit people who haven't walked in months are suddenly scrambling out of bed to go get the gold.
It's the psychology of a gold rush. And the interpretation here is just brilliant. Spurgeon says the sick forget their sickness because they are too busy gathering the blessings. It's a call to be active.
I love that idea. That you can be too busy winning to even notice you're hurting.
It's the power of distraction, but like a holy distraction. If you are actively engaged in gratitude or service or gathering the gold of your faith, you just don't have the mental bandwidth to sit around and dwell on your ailments. You might still be limping, but you don't identify as a limper. You identify as a victor who just happens to have a limp.
It's a shift from a passive state, lying in bed thinking about your pain, to an active one.
Yes. Spurgeon is challenging the listener. Don't sit around nursing your gloom. He says, rise up and gather the spoil. There is so much grace available that even if you are weak, you should be out there collecting it. And the very act of collecting it makes you forget the weakness.
It really challenges how we deal with chronic issues, doesn't it? It's not about denial. It's about priority. It's, I have something more important to do right now than be sick.
Precisely. And that momentum leads right into the final perspective he discusses. So we've looked at the present joy, the active gathering. Now we look to the future, to anticipation.
The future tense logic.
Right. Spurgeon argues that the inhabitant doesn't say, I am sick, because they are already mentally living in the reality of their future cure.
He used that analogy of the blind man here.
Yeah. If a blind man knows for a fact, a 100% certainty, that he's having surgery tomorrow that will restore his sight, does he sit around today depressed about being blind?
No way. He's probably packing his bags and planning what he's going to go look at first.
Exactly. The certainty of the future cure completely overrides the reality of the present condition. He hardly counts himself blind. Spurgeon applies this to the believer. He says, we are on our way to eternal health.
The phrase is sown in weakness but raised in power.
It suggests we're just in the waiting room. And if you're in the waiting room for a procedure you know will fix you, your mindset is fundamentally different than if you're in hospice with no hope. Spurgeon saying that between the joy of pardon in the present and the certainty of resurrection in the future, the sickness of right now, it's rendered insignificant, becomes a footnote, not the headline.
It's a complete restructuring of how you perceive time and reality. So let's just recap this journey, because we've covered a lot of ground here. We started in a city under siege, where the natural response is just despair and complaint.
But we found that the root of the misery, he argues, isn't the siege, it's the guilt.
And once that guilt is gone, once you have present forgiveness, the whole framework flips. Suffering stops being a punishment from a judge.
And becomes discipline from a father, which removes the fear.
And then your behavior changes. The inhabitants stop saying, I am sick. Not because they're delusional,
but because they are overwhelmed by the joy of being restored.
They are morally sane, protected from the real plague, which is bitterness, and they're too busy gathering the spoils of victory, all that gold and silver of grace, to worry about their limps.
And finally, they're living in the future. They define themselves by where they're going, to eternal health, not where they are right now.
It really forces you to think about the power of those two words, I am. We live in a culture that loves labels. We identify so strongly with our conditions. I am anxious. I am sick. I am a victim.
We do. And Spurgeon isn't saying those conditions aren't real. He acknowledges the body is dead because of sin. But he's suggesting our spiritual status is the truer reality. I am is a definition of identity. If you say, I am sick, you're letting the illness define the whole container of your life. But if you say, I am forgiven, you're defining yourself by a relationship that transcends the illness.
That's the key takeaway for me. The source suggests that the state of your conscience, whether you feel forgiven or condemned, is actually the lens through which you see everything else. You can be healthy and miserable if that lens is dirty with guilt, and you can be sick and joyful if the lens is clean.
It puts the agency back in your hands to choose your focus. You can stare at the siege or you can stare at the spoil.
So here is a final provocative thought for you to mull over. Spurgeon implies that memory, language, and identity are all linked. The inhabitant ignores their sickness to focus on their pardon. So to what extent are we defined by what we choose to articulate about ourselves? If you stop saying, I am sick, or I am poor, or I am tired, or I am overwhelmed, and started saying, I am forgiven, or I am loved, how might that actually change the neural pathways of how you experience your life?
It's that question of whether our words just describe our reality or if they actually help create it.
Something to think about. Thanks for diving deep with us today.
A pleasure, as always.